The prospect of a switch to OLED model has tantalized fans for a long time, and in recent days, a Korean journalist shared rumors, notionally from three separate sources, about a potential OLED model switch to, a story that was apparently triple sourced. Now, three sources sounds good, but it's no cast iron guarantee of credibility, especially if all three are derived from the same false information. I have some skepticism, but first, let's look at the surprising reason why a switch to OLED seems significantly more likely now than it was a year ago. Initially, the reasons for skipping an OLED with a launcher switch to were fairly obvious. Price. Nintendo have, from generation to generation, a high-end price point they like their consoles to meet, and generally they allow this to increase in real time between generations. $450 for Switch 2 was a slight, though not massive, bump up from the raw inflationary increase, which would have put the console at around $400. But even then, their margins were reportedly quite low. And actually, you can see in Nintendo's recent financials large income streams but far lower profit. That's not entirely uncommon with new technology. The Switch and Switch Lite had better margins than the OLED, which was newer after all. In theory, over time, large production numbers would drive down costs through bulk buying, the ability to negotiate, and because of efficiencies discovered during production. However, this hasn't worked so far during the Switch 2 era, and in 2026 we've seen a price increase to $500 due chiefly to memory price increases. It seems likely, in fact, that the era of price rises may only be starting, with the PlayStation 6 rumoured to cost truly eye-watering sums, and Nintendo themselves not ruling out subsequent price hikes. You might think, therefore, that this rules out something as potentially costly as adding on an OLED screen, but that's actually not necessarily the case. After all, the OLED screen itself is probably a fairly fixed cost. It's not going to be affected by memory, and while it's pricier than LCD, as OLED screens become more commonplace, there will be the potential to some degree of cost reductions from production at scale, something that might only be expedited if Apple, as rumoured, begin production of OLED screens for some models of their computers, which might move it more into the consumer electronics space, as well as, of course, being used for televisions. Initially, the entry of a large player into the market might restrict production, but long term, it may be a different story. Even if not, it's still quite significant that the OLED screen cost is fixed. Now, we don't know exactly the differential cost between the screen for the base Nintendo Switch and the screen for the OLED model, but it's obviously less than the $50 difference between the two consoles. And if we wind away the retail markup, we can say it's no more than $30, which of course also includes any costs for the new dock, extra memory, metal backplate, and other smaller changes in the Switch OLED build. It is clearly quite significant, as we know the margins dipped, but my guess is that the screen only added $10, max $20 onto the build price of the system, possibly even less. The thing is, though, if that's a flat fee, that's a much smaller part of a more expensive system, and of course the Switch 2's more advanced display is a more expensive starting point, and so the differential might be even less. It's also larger, so there may be a size issue that might make it costlier, but the difference in price from Switch 2 to Switch OLED needn't be as great in absolute terms, and is certainly unlikely to be as great in proportionate terms, which is significant if the price of the console is higher in any event due to other reasons. And so this provides Nintendo with an opportunity. If they can create a genuine top-end system priced at, let's say, $600, it could actually have a larger margin and absorb those potential players who do want the best quality version of the console and are not overly price conscious. Nintendo found strong take-up of the OLED model over the cheaper alternatives, and while I doubt an OLED screen would be the only mid-gen revision, they could certainly budget the revision to make the OLED screen one of the more significant costs, and perhaps try to keep a lower budget for the rest of the revision, hoping that the OLED itself will sufficiently drive take-up. Relative to the rest of the marketplace, they can then have a more entry-level system, some kind of Switch 2 Lite, however configured, probably being part of this consideration, but this might be more difficult to achieve. I don't think we should necessarily expect an OLED Switch 2 very soon, of course. Even the rumoured reports are suggesting 2028 or so, and frankly, I think longer is likely. Switch had its Lite release 2.5 years after the Switch, and the OLED 2 years after that, which would put a Switch to OLED, if history repeats, in 2029 or possibly early 2030, given the Switch 2 released a little later in the calendar year than the Switch, and so if you roll the same period forward, you end up in the middle of Christmas. The alternative would be that they actually release a higher end revision first, and again, there is some precedent for this. 3DS XL came before 2DS, most notably. Still, the budget model strikes me as the bigger immediate concern, unless they're trying to find elegant ways to mask price hikes. This does raise other possibilities, though. What if it's simply not possible to feasibly reduce Switch 2 in price, and they're forced to contend with the fact that once Switch is superseded, Switch 2 will be the budget model for a while? There are still options that Nintendo can employ in this case. Especially with Switch discontinuing in Europe with battery changes, they could issue a new model Switch that integrates with Switch 2 but doesn't natively play Switch 2 games, and this might be a tempting stopgap possibility. It would be weird to release a fourth Switch into the market, but a final version of the Switch would allow them to replace 3 lines with one, and it could be geared explicitly as a complement to the Switch 2, perhaps with features like access to Nintendo Switch Online titles previously exclusive to Switch 2, such as GameCube and Virtual Boy. Another possibility would be to add the capacity to buy Switch 2 games, but with two stark provisions. One, it would only be on a digital-only basis, but also the system would only stream them, meaning that you would need a working internet connection for the most part in order to play the games. I will caveat this by saying that many people are more technologically minded than me, so I'll pin the most reasonable and authoritative appraisal of this concept in the comments. However, I would assume that this would be rather less costly to produce and could allow Nintendo to produce a budget model of the Switch, which has some significant forward compatibility into the Switch 2 market. It may well be the case that they dispense entirely with framing it as a new Switch and just mandate the game, Switch or Switch 2, be digital to use the machine, something which of course might be slightly controversial after PlayStation's recent takes, but I think would probably be accepted as a lower price offer on the market. In theory, this risks backlash from Switch owners, but might be worth it if they could meet a very low target price, $250 say. With the Switch generation, Nintendo could take a steady approach to growing their family of systems because circumstances allowed for that. 2019 was when the 3DS was retired, so Lite made sense then. In 2021, it was sensible to offer a mid-gen Switch 2 upgrade. But if their version of a Switch 2 Lite is really designed for the liminal space between Switch and Switch 2, a better analogy might be the new 2DS XL, which happily released only weeks after the Switch in 2017. Note also that 3DS was still being sold at a trickle even up to 2021, so OLED in some respects represented a new top-of-the-market entry, with the 3DS falling off at the bottom end. Replacing Switch's 3 models with a 3-model lineup of Switch 2 for 2028, bringing therefore 2 new consoles to market in the next few years, would elegantly give Nintendo a 3-pronged approach to kick off the generation, and a high-spec OLED and a low-spec streaming system would be targeting radically different audiences and price points, so releasing the two in a short space of time, perhaps only a year apart, like the 3DS iterations, wouldn't be such a big deal. This might not even preclude a further mid-generation refresh of a more substantial technological nature, of course. We had both the 3DS XL and ultimately the new 3DS XL. I think Nintendo will want this generation to run and run if possible, and so having a new 3DS XL style refresh around 2031 remains something I could see being useful as an offer to third parties who might want to reach a Switch 2 audience, but who would struggle with its relative lack of power, especially as we transition into the era of the PlayStation 6. At any rate, at this point, I think there is a 30% chance that we do see some kind of announcement of an OLED model before the end of 2029. I think it's still likely that there will be something OLED coming, but even so, I don't expect it anytime soon. As for other revisions, well, I've got different videos which will go into this, and so for now, I'm going to say thank you so much for watching. Do check out these absolute classics on the screen, and I will see you next time for another Nintendo Forecast.